Welcome back, viewers. You are still tuned into Prime Live. One of the constants that we can absolutely guarantee is that life is going to change, and that change will happen, and it will constantly do so. A groundbreaking podcast has been underway for some time now called When Change Happens Podcast. The podcast is hosted by award-winning journalist Ruda Landman, who is a change and personal resilience expert, as well as her co-host, Dr. Frank Magwegwe, who now is amazing to be able to have this conversation with both of you and to be able to talk to you more about the podcast as well. Now, the series also involves a change of stories where everyday people who have experienced life-altering events that changed over the course of their lives, or rather changed their lives forever. Now, without giving too much away, I'm so pleased to welcome Ruda Landman, who will tell us more about this incredible podcast. Ruda, thank you so much for joining us on Prime Live.
Thanks, Nadia. It's lovely to be here.
It's such a privilege to be able to have this conversation with you. The fangirl in me is absolutely dying inside, and I cannot remember the last time I've been so nervous and so excited to do an interview. But thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
I mean, this podcast has been incredibly groundbreaking in the sense that it's telling real stories about real people's everyday experiences. And change is something that a lot of us fear and a lot of us struggle to adapt to as well. So I think it's a really fitting conversation to be able to share people's journeys and how life-altering decisions and life-altering changes can really bring about immense change, but how you can still cope with it thereafter as well. But can you talk us through what was exactly the concept and the inspiration for starting this podcast? I know that you co-host it with Dr. Frank as well. Can you talk to us the conceptualization of the podcast and what was the inspiration?
Well, Dr. Frank is a change scientist, we call him. And that was, for me, fascinating in the beginning to find out that there is such a thing as a theory of change, and that there is a pattern in which it happens. Frank has this wonderful little formula which says D times V times F must be greater than R. Your dissatisfaction with where you're at times your vision for where you want to be times the success of your first steps, the F, must be greater than the resistance. Otherwise, change won't happen. And when Frank and I started talking, there's a website called The Change Exchange, which is run by BrightRock, which is a life insurance company. And they host a discussion of the science of change. They also have a little course that you can do to test yourself. How change ready are you? If you're planning something, what are the steps, etc. So they approached us, Frank and me. We did another series last year called Change in One Generation, which was about South Africans who started from nowhere. You know how many South Africans go to university and they are the first in their family, the first generationers. And we looked at people like that who had managed to change their own and their families' lives exponentially. So that was the first series. And then BrightRock said, no, they want a second one with more varied examples. So this time round, we have a young woman who was busy with her PhD when she fell pregnant with twins. A man who was in a high-powered corporate job had a heart attack at 41. Someone who left his corporate, very safe, secure job after 23 years to start a business renting out bikes for delivery. A woman who had to retire at 60 from a job that she loved. And retiring can feel like stepping off a cliff. I think many of your viewers will know that. And then someone who came back from drugs and alcohol. So it was a completely varied group of people, but it's so fascinating to see the patterns that you can recognize that are the same in all of those changes.
I mean, that's incredibly fascinating to learn. I think I'm learning so much from this conversation as well, is that change is actually a science. And it is something that a lot of people spend their entire lives being afraid of. we get so comfortable with our normal everyday routines. We get so comfortable being in the same position. But like I was saying earlier in the introduction, is change is the only constant that we can't get used to. But it is the only constant, and it is the only guarantee. And just from those 5 subjects that you are going to be discussing in the podcast, or have already started discussing, I think there's many people out there who will be able to resonate in some way or form with the 5 different characters and the changes they undergo in their lives. And I think that's so important, because being able to adapt is something that you've got to get very good at. It doesn't matter how young you are, how old you are, your life is constantly going to be able to change. And being able to adapt to that is something that, will enhance your ability to reach your goals, or enhance your ability to learn to be comfortable in those changes and in those difficult circumstances as well. Now, during the podcast, can you talk to us about how these 5 characters, or these 5 different stories, how will you discuss the changes? How will you conceptualize them, and what can we expect?
Well, in each case, you hear a life story. People remember me from Carte Blanche, and these days Carte Blanche is synonymous with find the villain of the week and nail him to the wall. That was never my favorite. I have enormous respect for my colleagues, my other journalists who helped save this country over the past 15 years or so, but it's not my favorite thing. I love hearing people's stories. I love supporting people in telling their story, and that's what we do. And then Frank looks at the story and he says, well, the science or the theory says that in general this and that happens. In this story, I see it play out in this way. And here's the pattern. And this is why this person found this part of the whole process so difficult. But someone else managed to do it because of. It's really fascinating. And the one thing, that became so clear for me that I had never realized before was that every change also entails loss. However much you may desire the change, you have the vision, you are dissatisfied, you have the vision, you want to get to the other side of the change, but you are also losing something. And I think if we can acknowledge that and almost, not to over-dramatize, almost grieve the loss and allow yourself to grieve the loss, then change becomes easier.
I think that's so powerfully said, because I think for somebody like me who also has always struggled with change and adapting to change, I think that's exactly why we fear it so much. Even when it comes to growth and drastic life changes that pushes you in a completely different direction, we're either grieving our old selves, the part of ourselves that we were at that time in our lives, or we're grieving the people we were around, or in the environment we are around. And I can completely understand why you might say that people who have retired also feel like they've lost that part of themselves. That part of themselves that was working, that was active, that had a social group of people they worked with. You lose that part of your identity, and you spend so much of your life working. You're almost losing a completely huge part of your life. So I can completely understand that, and I really appreciate the connection that you've made there with loss and change, and that we are inevitably losing something in order to change, even if it is a positive change and you're moving up. And I think you feel like that when you end up out of high school. You miss that young part of yourself. You miss that young, carefree version of yourself that didn't have responsibilities and didn't have to worry as much. So even with positive change, there always is a certain degree of loss as well.
And what you said there about identity, that's one of the other through lines, is that change involves also a shift in identity. My older brother, when he retired, he said it's not the doing nothing, it's the being nothing, because we are so identified with what we do that to let go of that. Wendy Celebe, the woman who retired, she said she was so looking forward to it. And then that day she drove to the office and she thought, oh yeah, my last day. And then as she walked into the office, she started crying, because tomorrow I would need someone to come and sign me in. I wouldn't have a team anymore. I wouldn't be the boss. So it's about identity. The Costa Karastavrakis, who was the recovering addict, as he describes himself, he said, at the depth of all of that, he said to himself, is this really who I am? So it's not so much about the, I don't want to do this anymore. It was about, I don't want to be this anymore. And that's another thing, you know, if you can think about it in a bit of, kind of get a bit of distance and see it almost in theory, then it's as if it gets easier.
It's almost like we have this kind of undying attachment to our old selves, or to that old version of ourselves. Even if it is something that's negative, you are sort of attached to that a sense of self and that sense of identity as well. But in closing, what do you hope viewers, or listeners rather, from the podcast take away from the podcast? And of course, the biggest question we're actually getting from our audience this evening is, where can we find all the episodes and where can we listen in?
The website is changepodcasts.co.za, easy enough. And when you go there, you will find links to all the platforms. So whatever your platform is, it will be there. Changepodcasts.co.za. And I think the one thing I would like people to take away is, in the first place, it happens to all of us. It's not just me. Everyone responds to change in different ways, but it's not easy, but it can be done. And there are definable steps and ways of looking at it that can actually make it easier.
I think that was very, very powerfully said. And I'm so in awe of our conversation today. I think it's definitely helping me see change a little bit differently, and helping me also understand and figure out why we become so closed off to change and why we're so afraid of it as well. But thank you so much for joining us this evening. I mean, this has been incredibly insightful, and personally from me, an absolute honor to be able to interview somebody that I watched growing up and wishing I was you. So I'm so completely honored by the opportunity to chat with you, and I really love the platform that you and Dr. Frank have established. This podcast is going to be so instrumental in assisting people with, yes, reaching their true potential and reaching their goals, but also allowing themselves to be kinder to themselves and being kinder to accepting the changes that life is inevitably going to throw our way, whether we like it or not.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
It's such a pleasure. Viewers at home, do let us know your thoughts on our social media platforms. We'd love to hear from you. How do you deal with change? Are you coping well with change? And if not, you better tune into the podcast to learn about 5 different subject stories on how they are dealt with life-changing or life-altering circumstances or decisions, and how they've handled it, as well as understanding the art, or rather the science, of change. Do let us know on all our social media platforms, and do interact with us as well. But on that note, it is time for us to head over to an ad break, and we'll come right back.